morning. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning. I hope that you enjoyed the long weekend, and we are now moving right along in the quarter. We're already here in the third week of class, and so even though we've had a little bit of a late start, we're continuing to work through some of the key ideas related to small group communication. So kind of similar to last Friday, we'll be going over some ideas, and then we'll be dedicating a lot of the class time to another group activity that has us applying and using some of these ideas. This week's focus is going to be on listening in small groups. So I know some of you are already in my other listening class, so some of this might be a review, but a lot of the new stuff that we'll be talking about is about how being in a group, right, brings in some unique challenges, being an effective listener, following along, paying attention. Being a good listener, in fact, is one of the biggest skills that employers are looking for jobs, right? It's one of the most useful life skills because by understanding and paying attention to the messages we hear every day, we can become much better at making sense of and advocating for our own issues. So to start, I'm going to have you complete the first part of an attendance activity. So if you're on Zoom, you're welcome to type that up, and then at the end of class, you can email me your attendance for the day. Today's activity, right, is asking you to think about this topic. In what ways has social media impacted your relationships? Has it brought you closer together or further apart, right? There's a lot of debate or disagreement about whether social media has brought us together and created connections, or if it's created distance and made it harder for us to connect with one another. So I want you to think about this for a few minutes and share your own perspective on the topic. This is not a right or wrong answer, but instead to think about what your own opinion is on this right now. Take some time to write or type some of your thoughts on this. You won't need to turn this in yet, but you will be using this a little later in class. give you a couple more minutes to work on this. Go ahead and finish up the first thought or idea that you're writing. Again, I'm just going to ask you to hang on to this for now, and we'll be going back to this prompt in just a little bit. I also want to take the time to acknowledge that from what I've seen and folks that I've talked to so far, I know that this quarter has been really challenging, right? With Omicron cases spreading, with I think a lot of fatigue or exhaustion folks might have from the fall, right? So I recognize that like these past 2 years have been pretty rough, and I don't personally know the feeling of going through that as a student, but I do want to understand and empathize with that. So if you find yourself at a point in the quarter where you're really falling behind, where you need extra help, extra support, you're welcome to contact me, and I'm happy to help with like developing a plan going forward, right? So I just want to reiterate that if you're having trouble, if you're falling behind, if you're feeling really stressed out, that you have the opportunity to reach out and to work with me on moving forward. So I know this has been not a great start to the year, so just wanted to acknowledge that. So I wanted to do a quick recap of 3 things from last class. So last Friday, we did the survival activity where you're stranded in the middle of the wilderness. You only have so many items that you need to put together in order to survive. That was a way for us to think about how small groups communicate in terms of roles and membership. Some people came in with more or less experience on issues, or came in with ideas on their goals if they were trying to get out of there or trying to survive in place for a little while. So there's a chance for us to start to develop some of these ideas. And we've also talked about things like culture and media that impact our communication in groups too. Some of the things that we went over as well were related to that group membership reflection, right? So that is due coming up here in a week. So make sure that you are working and thinking about that. Remember that the prompt is available on Canvas, and that it's asking you to think about a group that you are or have been a part of, and the way that your group membership has been impacted. So, for instance, some of the things that your group does, some of the ways that you communicate within your group, some of your group's dynamics are things to incorporate into this. And again, I'm happy to look at rough drafts or outlines. It's only a short 2-page assignment, so make sure to start to think about and map out this one since it's coming up. Last class, we talked about culture, right? The idea that culture can run in a spectrum of context, low context cultures being ones where messages are very clear and direct and don't have a lot of subtlety or subtext. High context, meaning that things such as tone of voice, facial expressions, and so on mean a lot. It's how the message is understood and delivered, right? So different cultures, including nationalities, generally have very different contexts. Saying no in the United States could be seen as fine, whereas saying no in a country such as China or Japan, right, is seen as more disrespectful. So working in groups means acknowledging sort of the different ways that culture and context shape our communication. We also talked about this idea of media richness, right? That when we work in groups, a lot of people have mentioned that they use avenues such as Snapchat, texting, including group text, and so on. That's a part of how we work together in groups, right? But the idea is that the leaner the medium, right, the less sensory information and engagement we have, the harder it is for us to understand the message, for groups to work together, and so on, right? There's oftentimes greater ambiguity and lack of clarity when you don't have multiple ways of engaging with your senses. When we communicate face to face, right, we see the physical space of people, we hear their tone of voice, we see their physical proximity to us, we pick up on so many nonverbal cues that can be up to 85% of how we communicate, that there's a lot more that we can understand when we work together in groups too. So it's important for us to think about the level of engagement and how we work with groups too. So those were some things that we went over last class. And this class we'll be talking again about listening and the importance of listening for engaging in small groups effectively. And then a little bit later, we'll be returning to your attendance activity and using that for our second small group work. So I'm curious to hear just kind of a couple perspectives here on what listening is and how somebody might define listening in their own words. So Eli, do you want to take a crack at that? What is listening?
So listening is like taking in input from someone, like understanding it in your own way and being able to say it out in your own words. It makes sense. Taking in someone's message.
Yeah, so taking a message, understanding the message. I like that you bring up, right, understanding it in your own words, right, or making sense of it for yourself. Meg, is there anything you would want to add to defining? Yeah, so I think Eli hit on a really good starting point in defining and explaining what listening is, right? Listening is active, right? So listening is not your ears are picking up on information, right? That's just hearing. Listening is also not just through the use of sound. Listening can cover your eyes, right? Your use of facial expressions. It can also be things such as touch, right? Physically using touch and proximity to other people. I guess it can involve taste or smell, depending on the situation. Probably not. Sound, sight, and touch, though, are the three primary ways that we listen to other people. One example of this, right, is if two people are talking and one person is spending most of the time down on their phones, right? It would be hard for us to say that that person is listening to us. Yes, they're hearing the sounds and the vibrations in their ears, but they're not really paying attention to the speaker and to their message. We can see that their mind is another place since they're on their phone. It doesn't seem like they're following along, right? So we use things such as looking at the other person, using nonverbal cues and facial expressions to show that we understand their message, right? And also, listening means that because that other person is gesturing, moving their hands and their face and all of that, right? That listening means we're picking up on that component of communication. So as Eli brought up, right, it's about understanding in your own words, right? So understanding and making sense of what this message is. Evaluating, right? So evaluating is making a judgment about the message. Is this message good? Does it make sense or not, right? For instance, if somebody is to say something like, well, we're currently in February, you would evaluate that message and say, no, we're in January, although time has been a little bit weird. Recalling, right, is remembering a message for later. So you might not, if a message is not important to you, right, you might just forget it, and go to short-term memory, which generally lasts like 15 minutes, and you don't come back to it. But to recall is to really hit on the point. Maybe you talk to a friend, you say, hey, I remember what you were talking last week about with your job interview. I hope that went well. And then giving feedback. Again, feedback can be both verbal and nonverbal, right? It can be saying yes, using that to acknowledge. It can also involve nonverbal. For instance, nodding, looking at the other person, and so on, is a way that you show to that person that you understand their message, right? We oftentimes will do fake or pseudo listening. So if you ever talk to somebody and they're using like verbal feedback in a way that doesn't make sense to your message, for instance, you're talking and you're saying, hey, I've been having a good day today. I've gone to the store and then and they like just interject in the middle of the sentence with verbal feedback. It's a good sign that somebody's not really listening. So then you might have heard the phrase active listening used before. So building on that idea, you know what listening is? It's this process that involves really comprehending, understanding, recalling a message. Active listening goes a little bit further than that. So active listening, right, is the ways that you're able to engage and focus on a message and use some of the strategies of the listening process to make your listening more effective. One of the ways that you can do that is through showing attentiveness and presence. Again, getting off a phone, looking at somebody, nodding, showing that you're paying attention to them in a way that feels genuine and real, right? That oftentimes will give the other person confidence that their message is being heard and understood, right? Oftentimes people will feel deflated or just stop talking if they feel like somebody isn't listening to them. Again, nonverbal ways showing listening, if they are appropriate to the situation, like nodding, or even using verbal feedback, like yeah, that makes sense. If it makes sense in the sentence itself, right, and you're saying it at the right time, it can really show that you understand the message. Active listeners try to avoid interrupting, right? So while you can use verbal feedback to respond to a question, right, finishing somebody else's sentences or sandwiches is probably not the best way to go about listening effectively, right? Oftentimes people can feel frustrated if somebody finishes a sentence for them because they think, well, that's not what I was going to say. That's not how I was going to finish the sentence. And because our minds work faster than our ears in hearing a message, right? We oftentimes let our mind wander, let our mind drift, and we get anxious and try to get sentences finished on our own terms. So that's oftentimes why we will finish other people's sentences for them, because we get frustrated and we want it to be done, right? So that can be a challenge, right? Is interrupting somebody else or cutting them off or changing the subject while they're speaking. That can be a major issue too in making sure that people can have their voices heard. This is especially a problem in groups, right? Because oftentimes if you're a member of a group, you might not feel like you've been able to get your perspective or idea in, and you want to jump into the conversation. So sometimes interruption is more likely to happen in those situations because you're trying to get your opportunity to communicate. Active listeners are choosing the message, right, over your own voice or your own inner dialogue. So again, we tend to actually understand messages fairly quickly, right? Oftentimes, our brain is processing information at a much faster speed than the words are coming out. What that means is, as somebody is talking, right, our brain is going in a lot of different places. We're starting to think about, what we had for breakfast, what we're going to do after class, and all of those things, right? So one of the challenges is bringing it back and refocusing on the message and trying to understand the message, right? Not letting your inner dialogue or voice overwhelm you and get you off task. Active listeners are also paraphrasing, right? So if you're involved in the group, particularly if you're facilitating and guiding a discussion, one really good way to do that is to reiterate and say what somebody else said back at them. So listening, right, in groups through paraphrasing can be really effective because oftentimes people can feel like messages are misunderstood or misconstrued, right? And that oftentimes is because we engaged in distorted listening. We didn't fully understand the message, and therefore we set it back in the wrong way. Clarifying questions can also help, right? For instance, wait, what time is your class again? Can help show the other person that you're interested, that you care, and that you're focused on understanding the meeting. So, right, listening can be really useful, but listening can also bring about some unique challenges that I think are useful to think about when we're working in groups. So addressing some of these challenges can involve giving people like special or focused time. One useful strategy if you're in a group is to say, hey, I've noticed that you haven't really had the chance to share much. What's your perspective, right? And letting an unheard or underrepresented voice speak out. Again, avoiding interruption is one really important strategy, right? Oftentimes we're really compelled to finish somebody else's sentence, but we just have to hold that back for a minute to really get what they're trying to say, right? You might do something like, sitting on your hands or putting your arms behind your back or something to like verbally remind you that you shouldn't be interrupting. Avoiding judgment, right? So evaluation is useful and is a part of the listening process. But if we rush to judgment without hearing what somebody has to say, that can be challenging, right? We oftentimes do what's called defensive listening, where if we hear a perspective that disagrees with us, particularly on social and political issues, we just kind of shut down and dismiss the message right away without hearing it, right? So hearing something out is important, even if you disagree. Accepting other people, including people as part of the group, is an important idea too, right? You have to accept somebody to pay attention to or care about their message. Showing that you understand, right? Again, using nonverbal feedback and responses. There's something called the Jefferson Rule that could be a really useful strategy. If you ever hear a message and you think, wow, I disagree with this, I don't like this, and you want to fire back and respond to the message, right? Count to 10 in your head before you respond to a message that like riles you up. That's actually a useful strategy because rather than like responding right away and saying something you regret, like insulting somebody else, you can take the time to think, do I really need to say this? Or is there a way I could rephrase my frustration toward this person in a way that's a little bit more constructive? So count to 10 in your head if somebody is upsetting you and you need to respond. And again, right, respect and communication among the group, not something that happens right away, but happens over time as people understand and listen to each other a little bit better. Forming relationships with each other means we're more invested in understanding and hearing what somebody else has to say. Again, listening in groups brings about a lot of different challenges. So how many people have heard of or are familiar with the bystander effect? So the bystander effect, sounds like a couple of you, is the idea that a larger a group is, the less likely somebody is in that group to do a task. For instance, right, if you see somebody who's attacking or hurting somebody else, right, if you're the only person that saw that, you're pretty likely to like call 911 or try to do something to break up, or at least to show some level of concern for the fight. But if you're in a crowded group of people and you see that somebody is attacking somebody else, right, you're less likely to respond and be the one to do it because you think somebody else will do it. And because everybody thinks somebody else will do it, nobody does it. So the more people there are in a group, the less likely you might be to be the person to take responsibility and to address an issue. For instance, if one person in your group is tasked with being the one to clean out the lockers, you don't want to do that. You might even play like nose goes to see who has to do it, right? But because there's a larger group, you're less likely to volunteer because you're waiting for someone else. So that can be one challenge of listening and engaging in a group. Another challenge is the idea of Zoom fatigue. In digital meetings, right? Because we have multiple people and a lot of different verbal and nonverbal signals to pick up on, we tend to feel really exhausted. Our brains are working overtime to try to process and understand messages, especially, again, if they're in these flat rectangles on Zoom. You might not know as much about what people are talking about. For instance, if people start talking about bands and music that you've never heard of, right, then you might not feel like you could engage in that conversation and you might tune in. It can be difficult to keep up with the changing engagement and participation in a group, especially, again, if topics change, if People get on different tasks, right? You oftentimes might not feel like you kept up. Because there are a lot more people in the group, overall, you have less of a chance to speak and to influence the opinions of other people. You're talking one-on-one, right? It might be 50-50, 60-40, etc. But if you're in a group of 5, right, you, the majority of the time, are not going to be the one speaking. Listening, right, can also prevent you from getting your own ideas out. Oftentimes, we listen to respond. For instance, if we're sharing our perspectives and ideas on something, right, it's not that we're understanding the other people, it's that we're preparing for what we're going to say and bring in. That can be a challenge with listening too. We can daydream and drift, right? That oftentimes happens when we feel like we've gotten off task or we can't connect with the message. And the idea of social loafing, right? Or bystander effect, that we're not paying attention to a message because we think other people are going to do it, can be a problem working in groups too. At the same time, though, right, working in groups can be really effective because groups have the ability to develop synergy or connections that you just couldn't get alone. There's more time to understand the messages people are saying. If, right, at any given time, only one person in the group can speak, that means you're spending a lot more of your time listening rather than speaking. There are more perspectives and ideas, right? People are bringing more thoughts, ideas, and lived experiences to the table, which you'll see in just a minute. And there are out-of-the-box solutions, right? Unorthodox ideas that you could develop because you're toying with ideas and perspectives and bringing those ideas to a group. For instance, right, maybe you come in with an idea about a new company logo, and you share the idea, and somebody says, "That's great. What if we added a yellow stripe to it?" "Oh, that sounds awesome. What if we added a yellow stripe and then a green stripe under it?" And so people start to develop and workshop ideas over time that can create a solution to a problem that somebody alone would not be able to do, right? So there's a lot of benefits and ways that working in groups can be great if we're able to deal with those challenges and hazards of listening. One example, right, of groups using listening effectively are through the usage of common spaces. So a lot of companies such as Apple, Valve, Microsoft, and so on, right, will in their offices have these kinds of lounges, common spaces that they encourage people to regularly use as a way to understand and listen and form relationships with one another, right? The use of common spaces can be really helpful in working in a group because it lets people have a physical space where they can create those connections with one another. So spaces that are designed for listening can be really effective ways to help build relationships and develop one another over time. So what I'm going to do now is, since we have 15 people here and 2 people on Zoom, I'm going to divide into 3 groups of 5, and then the Zoom folks will be a partnership. I'm going to give you about 15 minutes, and what I want is for each member of the group to share their perspective on the topic that I asked you to work on for today's prompt. How social media impacts relationships, it's brought it together or further apart. And as people are sharing and talking about this topic, I want you to practice active listening and some of the skills that we've been talking about. In particular, I want you to take notes on and take note of the perspectives and points shared by other people in the group. And the challenge here, right, is I want you coming out of this activity to be able to understand the perspective that each member of your group has on this topic. If you're on Zoom, right, you're welcome as a partnership to continue to talk about this in more detail and get a more detailed perspective on that other person and their views on this topic. So let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So we'll have 5 and 6. And then Zoom folks, I'll put you in a breakout room. Make sure everybody gets a chance to share. And we'll come together in Tibet.
What do you guys think of
it's hard to meet your friends because they can anytime chat in calling. We'd have to meet face to face. But the good thing is like you can meet anyone like you never thought like living somewhere else country. You can talk with your language. They're not something. It's supposed to be not. If you're far away from someone, and then I said, like, how to get down for I
think the social media has its share of relationships, positively and negatively. I believe there's like a lot of new connotation and like status connotation that comes with social media. So like if you're seeing someone on Red, you're gonna like get like heard about that versus like a big deal. And then like if you know someone who has like 10,000 followers on Instagram or something on that, you're gonna think that like give them a higher status and they can just be the same person, type of person you and then like use like every like social media connotation to have different than face to face. I believe social media has also made it more socially skilled from face to face conversation, but our virtual communication has jumped tremendously.
Alright, so social media, I said I got like the ingredient of people closer together, like relationships when you put it together like our way, you know, you have that concept of communication, checking how they're doing, stuff like that. Also, the thing is to get back and impact our relationship kind of dominates the face-to-face interaction, so a little bit crucial. Social media also limits social media is however big false expectations going on. Getting a chance to meet a person. See that they're doing something else and they're not doing it, it just makes people all hurt. In reality, there's other things that we do, more even if we have to get to respond to people, there's like little things that now we're getting more upset with. When in reality, it does like face-to-face communication, and it'd be a lot more different. There's not all of these things that we need to interpret into our own like interpretations and stuff like that. And I think with texting too, that more people read it.
It just really depends on the person. I mean, there's a whole layer of communication we're not getting. We don't get the facial cues, we don't get the tone.
I like how, like, you're kind of engaging with other perspectives, everybody's
Or in the middle?
I think it definitely like has its pros and cons, but I think we have a strong relationship. I think more face-to-face interactions, more people than other definitely has our place. Like you're away from somebody that you have a strong relationship with, it keeps you connected. Inside, I think that really have a strong relationship. Sometimes I feel like social media can get more into constant topics and now social media instead of having, go and hang out with them, see what they're up to, and stuff like that, and actually, and I definitely feel like you can't really have that strong relationship with somebody on social media.
Yeah, I think that the relationship needs to be built first. But I mean, like, it's like you can build on social media, and then like create stronger bonds.
Yeah, definitely that part of it, like, social media is a talk to people that never been able to talk to before, or like, people that never met, because like, you can't get from a small town, and you're talking to somebody else, like, yeah, a couple towns away from here, like, social media is helping, but also, yeah.
So if your group has wrapped up its discussion, you might take some time to return to your activity that you did at the beginning of class to summarize, make sure you have a written version of everybody's perspective. So using the notes that you put together already, or just the things that you remember. I also would like you to take a moment. Yes, Scott.
Should I put those questions on the attendance question?
Yes, you can add that in.
Should I?
Yes. And in addition to summarizing, right, take note about what you noticed about your own listening, what went well, and how you listened to and understood other groups. And then things that you feel like you can do to continue to improve on your listening. So you're welcome to write or type that as an addition to your attendance for the day. couple more minutes on this. I'd like to hear a couple of the perspectives that you all had doing this activity. So starting with this first question, what were some of the perspectives that were heard from other groups on the topic? I'd like to hear from somebody here that was in this group of five. What were the perspectives of group members that stood out to you? What did you notice in your group overall about this topic? Yeah, Haley.
A big thing that I noticed is they really touched on the fact that you can communicate with people outside of like your normal circle of people. Like for example, if you grow up in like a small town, you can talk to someone completely across the state, and that line of communication is open. We also really touched on how social media has added to like the complexity of relationships, and there's a lot of new conversations, status injuries, stuff like that.
Yeah.
From the social media.
Yeah, so as I was hovering and sort of listening to you all in different groups share, one thing that really stood out to me was that over time, you were adding sort of new ideas and perspectives and considerations about this topic that you didn't originally have, right? When I talked to Elena about it, Elena shared that, you know, there was a both and approach as far as both closer together and further apart for different reasons, different ways, right? So it's likely that through participating in this activity, there were things that you understood about this topic that you wouldn't have thought of on your own, or that you were reminded of that you wouldn't have thought on your own too, right? This group over here was mentioning some of the ways that things like physical distance and bringing people close together who are not able to regularly see each other can be improved through group communication too. How about from the middle group? Let's have somebody share what they noticed about their own listening as they were paying attention to the ideas shared in the group.
I noticed from our group, we all like went in circle into each other, so everyone got a chance to share their ideas and was very like orderly.
Yeah, thanks, Meg. So, right, that's not always the way that we would work together or communicate in groups, but that's a style of doing that where everybody brings their perspective or ideals to the table that can really help you in making sure that everybody gets their voice heard, right? It's a good starting point for discussion. How many folks found that their perspective, like in any way, like was changed or developed over the course of listening to other people? So most folks, it sounds like, generally felt pretty similarly, but did have the chance to hear, right? So one thing that can happen in groups is as people go around and share perspectives, you find that your own ideas shift a little bit too, or the way that you present them shift. For instance, I noticed a couple of groups saying, well, I agree, or I felt kind of similarly to X, Y, Z. The negative end of that, right, is a problem called groupthink, where because we're so interested in building consensus and connection, we don't let perspectives we disagree with be shared. So for instance, if everybody loved the movie and you hated the movie, right, you might be more likely to say, well, yeah, I enjoyed it too, because you don't want to add disagreement or discord into the group. So that can be a challenge if you're going around and sharing your perspectives, that over time, as you're hearing people speak, right, if you disagree, you might not choose to share it for the sake of appealing to the group. But going around is also a great way to build up ideas to say kind of similarly. Social media has brought me closer together with people that I don't see regularly, but for me, it also has prevented me from wanting to see people as often. How about somebody here from this group on the end? What is something that you noticed about how to improve on your listening skills?
I said, I don't make very much eye contact when someone's talking, especially when I'm focused on notes.
Yeah,
I said I was more focused on getting the words down and the meaning.
yeah, that can be a challenge, right? Especially when you're trying to take regular notes and follow along. So taking notes can be a good way to show your engagement, to show that you're listening to somebody else. At the same time, right, taking notes can also mean that you're missing certain things like nonverbal cues. So kind of like you were mentioning, having alternation between those two things can be a really good way to make sure that your message is heard and understood, and that you're able to show that you care, that you're trying to understand, right? You might be taking a note and then summarizing what it is that that person has to say. So these are all good things to think about again. Working in groups, listening in groups definitely brings about some unique challenges and benefits to the way that we understand and listen to one another. So to wrap up for today, we talked about listening, right? What listening is and what it means to be an active listener. We talked about some of the challenges, including the idea of so many voices being heard and difficulty in getting perspectives in, and the benefits to brainstorm and put ideas together in a way that you can't normally one-on-one or on your own. And then we use today's activity as a way to think about listening skills and the way that we can listen as a person. We'll continue to build on some of these ideas in listening, including what it means to listen in more digital and online spaces for next class. So go ahead and email me your attendance for today, or pass it forward if you wrote it down. Enjoy the rest of your week. Stay safe out there, and I look forward to seeing you again on